Yeah.
Okay, hello, welcome. Thank you for turning up for our seminar this evening. And before I introduce today's speaker, I'll just mention the remaining seminars that we have for the rest of this term. Just a reminder, all these seminars, almost all of them go up onto YouTube as well. So if you go to Oxford Biodiversity Online, you'll find the last 2 years on our seminars. It's an interesting range of things around nature recovery. But just to mention some of the ones that we have for the next few weeks. Next week we have Nicola Ranger talking about reimagining Bretton Woods, placing nature at the heart of global finance and governance. The week after we've got a panel discussion led by Connie McDermott on understanding human-nature relationships. And the week after we have John Payne on the inevitable loss of large mammals in Malaysia, the lessons not learned and pointers for the recovery of the surviving species. And the week after we have a double barrel, both on a Friday. At lunchtime, we're going to have Joe Roman, who is a famous discoverer of the whale carbon pump, talking about eat, poop, and die, how animals make our world. And that evening at 4:15, we have Charles Foster, the local writer, famous author of Being a Beast. But he's going to be talking about the screaming sky, the strange allure of swifts. So we've got a really interesting range of speakers for the rest of this term to come along to all of those. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Laura Pereira, our guest for today. And she's Professor of Sustainability Transformations and Futures at the Global Change Institute at Wits University in South Africa and a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre in Sweden. And she's the epitome of interdisciplinarity, having trained in ecology, law, zoology, and human geography. And she completed her DPhil here in this department in 2012, before working at various places, including the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, University of Cape Town, Stellenbosch University, City University of London, and Utrecht. So that captures a sense of the breathlessness of Laura's life there, I think. And she's currently well, you'll hear about what her focus is on, but she's currently an Earth Commissioner and an expert in the affairs, task force, and scenarios and models. So, to step off the plane this morning, so thank you for joining us here.
Thanks so much, Linda. Thanks for the invite. And I think this is on and working. Yeah, great. So, yeah, full disclosure, I literally landed at 5 a.m. this morning from Korea. So, if at some point I just start sleeping on the stage, that's fine. But really cool to be back here. Back in Sogi and being on this side of the board, which is quite fun. So yeah, what I'm going to talk to you about today is a combination of work that we've been sort of doing or pursuing for the past couple of years in a variety of different intergovernmental processes. So sort of ranging from IPPERS, which I think most people here are familiar with, the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, as well as the Earth Commission, also discussions that we've been having around IPCC and other global assessments like the Global Environment Outlook that UNEP does on just thinking, well, what does this future look like that we're trying to get towards? And so I do this every time, but it still generally works. This is an image from a colleague of mine, Andrew Berry's PhD on radical ocean futures by Simon Stalenberg. And I want you all to just indulge me for a second and close your eyes. I won't, because I might actually fall asleep. And if you do doze off in the back, that's absolutely fine. But just close your eyes and sort of think of the year 2100. And we got everything right. Managed to meet the SDGs. We managed to achieve the Paris Agreement. Managed also by 2050 to achieve the Global Biodiversity Framework. What does that world look like to you? You can think of your home, you can think of sort of right now where we are in Oxford. What would it look like? What would the buildings look like? Would we still be sort of sitting in a university lecture like this? I mean, 50, 60 years for Oxford is nothing. What would you have for breakfast? how would you have gotten to work and to school? Would there even be this notion of work, 9 to 5? You walked outside, what would you be hearing? Smelling. For those still awake, you can open your eyes. And for me, that's really, really difficult to do. I do it sort of like at least 2-3 times a year. And that's because we're surrounded by this, and particularly I think this week, everyone is sitting in a potentially dystopian, cataclysmic, what are we even doing with our lives? Fires, floods, heat waves, hurricanes, elections, these are the narratives that surround us. And so actually getting into that mental space of getting things right and sort of tangibly appreciating what it looks like is really hard to do. But at the same time, it's probably one of the most important things we do need to do, right? Because otherwise we can't start to orient towards them. And so together with the actual news headlines, the stories we tell ourselves, right, also tend to be quite distorted. It's quite easy. If I told you to come up with a 2100 where we continued business as usual or where everything collapsed, right? I think that would be really easy to imagine, right? You just needed Margaret Atwood sort of meets extrapolations of Mad Max and you probably get it. That's easy for us to imagine. It's the kind of stories that we tell ourselves. It's because we're surrounded by them. And these are important stories. So we do need to know what it looks like. We do need to know what continued trajectories are. But at the same time, we also need to build capacities to actually imagine what sort of transformatively different futures look like. And so coming to one of my favorite science fiction writers, William Gibson, who commented that the futures is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And it's unevenly distributed both in terms of the good and in terms of the bad. And that's sort of linked to this idea of the Anthropocene. So when we think of good things, technology, well-being, actually most of us living very, very successful sort of lives in general. But then also you're looking at the impacts, right, that we're seeing from climate change, that we're seeing from wars, etc., right? So those unevenly distributed impacts, right? Sort of is a potential sort of forewarning of what could be to come. That's because we're in the age of the Anthropocene. I think everyone here knows what the Anthropocene is. Sort of this epoch, which is not officially classified yet, but I think it's been a useful term to think of sort of humans being the driving force of impact on the planet, or one of the most powerful ones. And it's new, it's turbulent, it's accelerating, right? We think of the great acceleration graph sort of over the past sort of 50 to 150 years. Hyper-connected, COVID taught us anything, right? Definitely taught us that. But also unequal, right? So we're not just looking at a natural resource base, we're also looking at societal configuration. And I think we're all sitting in Oxford geography. We probably have also moved beyond the terms of just the Anthropocene. We've got the Pluthocene, we've got the Capitalocene, there's been the Manocene, I've also heard, sort of this idea of sort of gender politics being taken into account. And these are all just ways of thinking through some of the powerful structures that have organized sort of how we live on Earth as a species. And our need, in the instance of Donna Haraway's idea of the Pluthocene, of these new relations that we need to start to reconfigure or to build up. And so this brings me to some of the sort of the latest sort of science that also sort of explains to us sort of this moment that we're sitting at right now, why we're talking about the need for transformative change. And so I think this is the pointer. No, okay. That's totally fine. Okay. And so I think you're probably all familiar with our sort of very own sort of Kate Rayworth, who sort of expanded the initial sort of planetary boundaries framework from 2009, which I didn't put up here, to sort of talk about the fact that yes, we sort of crossed over thresholds of sort of these planetary boundaries, which are everything from fresh water to sort of ozone, air pollution, etc. But understanding that we also need sort of, it's not just about crossing ecological thresholds or biophysical thresholds. We need to be using these resources to meet basically the two, right? So there's a corridor. It's not just about pushing ourselves back down towards zero. It's about actually seeing what is that use space that we actually have. These are the updated planetary boundaries that were published in 2023, where you can see sort of a lot of red and purple. That's basically the message going over so many of these. And the idea is that, okay, knowing this, knowing sort of where we are at this moment, and thinking of the continued trends in this direction, how do you reverse that? What are the kinds of mechanisms or pathways for actually going back into what we're calling a safe operating space? And this is sort of, these ones are talking largely to sort of the science, the biophysical configurations, they're recognizing the fact that there's also a social component. What we did in the sort of first round of the Earth Commission, and this was the paper led by Pereira, was actually just talking about like unpacking a little bit about the inequality of these environmental impacts, which is something that I think we really need to be taking into account if we're not just looking at sustainable futures, but we're looking at equitable and just futures too. So basically, what this graph is showing you, the sort of percentage of the global population across sort of 4 of these key footprints, right? So the top one is energy, then water, then protein, and the proxy for food, and then produce capital. And basically what you're saying is that it's only going to get into the top 75%, but definitely the top 1 to 4% actually is where substantial amounts of the impacts are actually coming from. And I think what we finally did for everything apart from the food system, that the consumption or the impact from the top 1% was equivalent to bringing those who weren't actually having their basic needs met actually up to a point where you can meet their needs. So that literal redistribution, right, of consumption would be meeting needs. And that's what you're starting to see over here, just the sort of pressure on the Earth system from these key boundaries. And basically where you're looking at the yellow bar is sort of just achieving what we call access level 1, which is sort of meeting basic needs. Then access level 2 is actually escaping poverty, right? So being able to actually have enough to continue to thrive. And you're seeing that it's really just for climate, right? That you're seeing massive impacts going forward. And I encourage you to read the paper further. It was really quite an interesting analysis, obviously imperfect in terms of some of the proxies that we had to use, but I think still quite illustrative in terms of the relationship, which you see here, which is another paper that was led by Andrew Fanning, which talks about how we currently have a development paradigm where you're tightly coupling environmental impacts to meeting social development goals. So what you're seeing here, the number of biophysical boundaries that are being transgressed by countries mapped against the number of social thresholds that you're actually, so the social needs that you're meeting. And basically, I mean, it's the standard idea of you've got in the top right-hand corner, the US, Europe, etc., who are meeting a lot of their social needs whilst sort of transgressing a lot of biophysical boundaries. You've got in the bottom left-hand corner, a lot of developing countries who haven't crossed their biophysical thresholds, but also are meeting a lot of their social goals. You've got sort of countries in the middle, with Costa Rica being the standard sort of outlier in the middle. And the idea is that actually it's that top left-hand corner that we're trying to get towards, right? That's the safe and just operating space that Kate Rayworth referred to, which is where we're actually meeting social needs without actually transgressing our biophysical thresholds, right? And so the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, what does the world look like in that top left-hand corner? We don't have any good examples at the country level over here. And again, these are data at the national level that they used here. And so this is just finally the final graph, the rest of images story that I wanted to show, because it was recently published last month. It was the final long report from the Earth Commission 1.0. And this was the quantification of the safe and just corridor, again, trying to come up with numbers that are giving us both the planetary boundary, the biophysical safe, sort of ecologically safe, but also socially just. And socially just means where you're not actually, where you're avoiding harm, right? And this is interesting for the climate boundary. We actually moved it down, well, not we, the whole group, calculated to move it down from the 1.5 ecologically safe boundary to 1 degree actually as the just boundary, because they were saying that actually the kinds of harms or impact even from 1.5 means that you can't call that a just boundary, even though ecologically you're not necessarily going to be going over any thresholds or tipping points. But at the same time, also looking at those bottom parts, which are the dotted, or the dotted line and the dashed line. The dashed line is that access level 2 that I mentioned, the escape sort of from poverty, and access level 1 is the dotted line. Of also trying to quantify what that use actually needs to look like in order to actually sort of see what that the donut in the middle is. And we're still working on those numbers, so that's why they're not all sitting there. This is for 2018, so we wanted to do sort of an analysis, sort of pre-COVID impacts on sort of how the world was consuming, and then sort of extrapolating to 2050 with, I think it's 9.5 billion population, but you can see it in the paper, but I think that's what it is. And saying that actually for climate, without any massive transformations, there is no safe and just corridor based on how we currently use our energy systems to meet our social needs. And so we need to reimagine, right? We need to reconfigure how are we going to get there, because we know that this is absolutely critical. Okay, yeah, this is just a zoomed in, nicer version from the paper, just showing that, yeah, we're trying to move the earth balls, which are currently sitting outside, back into the safe and just space. Okay, so that's what that was all about. Again, the links to the papers are all here, and I'm more than happy to share them afterwards. Okay, so this begs the question, right? That earth sitting in that safe and just, what does that actually look like? All right, when we close our eyes, what does it look like to be in a safe operating space on planet Earth at different points? Anyone have an idea? No? So we have for the Convention of Biological Diversity, this vision of 2050 of living in harmony with nature, which is sort of to extrapolate where by 2050 biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. And I'm using the biodiversity framework because we don't have similar aspirational visions for climate. It's even more of a, let's just try and convince everyone to do what we can. But this is pretty powerful, right? You know, a vision of living in harmony with nature. The recent COP in Cali was talking about living in peace with nature, and what that looks like. We have goals, we have targets similar to the SDGs. We sort of know some of the numbers that we're trying to achieve, but what those numbers actually look like when we've achieved them is still kind of hard to grasp, right? And in particular, because there are many different pathways that you can actually take in order to achieve these kinds of endpoints. And I'll show you some of those examples. But for example, when I was mentioning the top 1%, right, of earners being sort of having the equivalent of meeting the needs of those who haven't been met. Redistribution, right? There's one pathway of move it from here, take it there, right? Whether it's financial, whether it's sort of other kinds of asset redistribution, reparations, terms that are coming on, you know, that's one pathway. But there's not necessarily the pathway that a lot of the powerful, those who are actually in charge, are necessarily going to agree with. So there could be other kinds of ways. Technologically driven ones tend to be quite a strong sort of advocate from those perspectives. So what that world actually looks like at the end of the day is very dependent on those kinds of actions or the sorts of discourses or paradigms that inform how you actually want to land up. And until we start to have those conversations, we're not going to be able to necessarily agree, or at least agree to disagree on what those pathways are. So working within the biodiversity space, there was this assessment that together with the pollinator assessment, one of the first ones that was run in 2016, there was a methodological assessment on scenarios and models. Because scenarios and models are largely how we think about the future, right? It's how we actually configure sort of the types of futures that could emerge. And it was sort of generally agreed that they're sort of really useful tools for policy, but that most global scenarios are developed for other purposes, largely climate, right? And so this is why it was important, again, coming from the biodiversity angle or the nature angle, rather than the climate space, because that was already pretty well covered. Most of the scenarios don't actually deal with positive or desirable futures. They're sort of really looking at other drivers of how things could go wrong and how wrong could they go. And they're looking at the impacts on nature rather than actually centering what nature could look like. They're not particularly participatory at the global level. They're generally very expert-led, and they don't really talk about some of these different policy management action interventions that I've been mentioning here. And so, I mean, these to this day continue to be the main storylines, the types of features. Those who are climate modelers in the room will be very familiar with these. The shared socioeconomic pathways that were published by Brian O'Neill and colleagues in 2017, basically looking at these two drivers, challenges to adaptation, challenges to mitigation, and coming up with these 5 narratives. So there's both the challenges, SSP1, bottom left, you've got fossil fuel, their development, regional rivalry, inequality, and middle of the road. And these are all amazingly quantified. You can sort of run most of your sort of global models against a combination of your RCPs with your SSPs in a matrix. But nature is not anywhere in this, right? And to a certain extent, neither are people. So the sustainability narrative is only sustainable in the context of climate, as in you don't have challenges to mitigation and adaptation. But actually, when you run it for most of the sort of biodiversity, sort of land use models, it's still pretty bad for nature, that sustainability scenario. And similarly, you could probably say that it is low on inequity with sort of strong in technological development, like their particular paradigms of how we're solving the problem that are embedded within this particular narrative. Yeah. So the idea is that, okay, for biodiversity, these are already bad. We need to develop new storylines. What could these talks look like? So as a task force, we sort of embarked on this kind of multi-year participatory process, sort of coming out of the assessment. We ran a participatory process. I can talk to you about running participatory processes at the global level at some point over a drink. It's interesting, but we did it. And then with a lot of expert involvement, we landed up developing what landed up being called the Nature Futures Framework at the national corner. As part of our stakeholder engagement through IPIS, we held a series of online dialogues. Again, this was hitting us sort of during the COVID period. And these are just some of the images that emerged from the IOK, the Indigenous Local Knowledge engagements with the African regional, the Asia region, and the Americas region. So again, being able to capture visually what you'd never be able to capture from a series of notes, which is really quite interesting. And so putting all of this together, again, in a multi-phase sort of approach, we landed up with going to plenary and actually negotiating the framework with the governments, and they welcomed the framework. It's not an official IPIS framework like the conceptual framework, but it was welcomed. And basically, what you have here is this triangular sort of heuristic, where you've got an infinite set of potentially desirable futures sitting in the triangle. And it's premised on the fact that we have diverse values for nature. So we've got instrumental values, which we call nature for society, intrinsic values, which we call nature for nature, and relational values, which we call nature as culture. And quite often, we were looking at the sort of models that we were doing, the indicators that we have. We're pretty good at nature for society, at sort of measuring and understanding our instrumental values, food production, and sort of climate regulation, for example. Much harder to understand or put a number to or quantify a model relational values, the existence of the sacred, the idea that actually in my culture there is no delineation between humans and nature, so that the spirits, the ancestors, they're all one, right? And they're connected fundamentally to this place. But that's equally important, and we tend to forget it in a lot of our narratives. This was trying to at least be explicit about it, right? So if we do have a massive gap in our stories, we can at least see it. And then the idea was that, and this was negotiated, that it's all very good and well that we can put a triangle here, and you can see that it's a relative space, right? As you're moving in one direction, you're moving away from some of the others. So there's trade-offs, but also potential co-benefits. This is because some of the decisions that you make in a particular place can't necessarily have all of these benefits, right? But that it's actually really, really messy underlying this, right? And that we have different values for nature in multiple places at different times. I can hold all of these because we're all really complex, messy creatures. So that was the framework. And so what we started to do with this is a variety of different things. This is actually where the microphone starts to pick me up. Okay. We did a lot of visioning exercises, like, okay, using this framework, can we start to envision some of these more desirable futures? We've also, with those visions, tried to come up with some of these pathways that we need to, okay, if we're going to get there, what are the types of actions that we need to take? Developing narratives, some storylines, then just trying to do some qualitative modeling. I've had a former master student, now a PhD student, trying to do some sort of causal loop diagram modeling and some of these reconfigured relationships. Moving into some quantitative modeling, there have been some land use change models that have arisen from this. But in particular, and to do the last two, developing indicators of what these pluralistic nature futures actually look like. What is it about these futures that's tangible that we actually need to use to measure success towards what we want to achieve, or when we're not actually doing well on those. So this is just an example of what we did to try and develop some 6 global narratives. So there's the corner of the triangle, but there's also the sides of the triangle, which is the space that I actually kind of like, because you've got to unpack sort of two different value perspectives and kind of navigate them. And so we developed 6 sort of what we call scenario skeletons, the global level, or what some of these extreme edges of the triangle could look like, understanding that there's a plural infinite combination within, right? So if you think of that as multiple pixels. But like, what is that edge space? Like, what is desirable versus what is not desirable? What's sitting outside the triangle? Can we actually start to come up with, like, qualitatively actually understanding what that fuzzy boundary is? And we were talking, wanting to take some of the discussions around transformative change or transformations that have been in the literature. And so one of them, sort of, you can see well, I know this backwards, so I would say the NNNT, but you guys don't know what I'm talking about. But the one is sort of an economics, post-growth versus green growth, right? And these paradigms of these are different ways that our economies can function, right? But you can't have both of them simultaneously. So there's a continuum. The other one was the half Earth versus the whole Earth idea, right? Set aside protected areas, keep people out, versus have a much more combined way of living with nature. And then within the food system, the land sparing versus land sharing, right? Against types of values that you can't do both of these things at the same time. You have to make a choice. You're going to have a continuum, but at some point you're going to have to make that choice. It's going to be informed by a particular value system rather than the fact that this is definitely 100% correct and this is definitely 100% incorrect. And what emerged from all of this is that we need to tell better science stories. That's what the final part of my talk is going to be about. And it's not just me saying it, it's an editorial in Nature saying we need to do it too. That's why I put it up there. And there's sort of 3 ingredients that I'd like to argue for that we need in order to tell better science stories. And the first is an improved imagination, like this quote by Ben Okri that talks about knowledge is empty without imagination, that no civilization ever became great on knowledge alone. That this other point of imagination helps us to transcend conventional thinking. And in particular, it's sort of the place where where stable facts and data can mix in with shifting emotions, memories, and intentions, right? So it's understanding that we're not just data-driven humans, but we have emotions, we have intentions. And then Beck in 1992 was already saying sort of something that I think is really poignant, particularly poignant even this week, is that when people are unable to incorporate novelty into the way they think about the future, then the lived experience of change becomes disorienting, promoting defensive and nostalgic reactions. And I think the rise of populism, the rise of a lot of the kinds of sort of voting patterns that you're starting to see is this fear of change, right? Is this yearning for a past that never was, right? But that we can make America great again. Yeah, you know, that it was great. You just need to go back, right? This yearning for this sort of this nostalgic reaction for a past that never existed. And sort of there's an argument here that imagination or being able to live with that change, right, or holding that capacity is important if we are actually going to move into a different future. The other is diversity of knowledge systems, right? That there are multiple ways of seeing the world, multiple ways of being in the world. We tend to just focus on a very Western scientific paradigm, and we need to do better at that. And this is not to sort of, as Chakabani said, to sacrifice equity and the altar of integration, not about integrating knowledge, it's not about making them the same thing, but it's about recognizing that each of them, that they're multiple and that together they can give us a much richer picture, right, of how we understand the world, how we live in the world. So this is an image, because there are historical power dynamics that have privileged particular knowledge systems over others. And maybe using those same tools to solve our problems is, you know, the full Einsteinian fool's errand, right? Maybe we need different ways of thinking about the world, of living in the world, if we are actually going to radically transform. And the final is creativity and participation. Right? We can't just sit in our ivory towers and come up with these stories of the world that we think everyone should follow. Right? It needs to be a bottom-up process. It needs to integrate different ways of seeing the world, different places, different people, different histories and contexts and experiences. And even though we can't do it with all sort of the billions of people on the planet, we can at least try to do a better job than we do right now. And so the final part is sort of taking some of this into the realm of speculative fiction, of science fiction. And sort of Nnedi Okorafor, one of my favorite authors, talks about science fiction being the only genre that enables African writers to envision a future from our perspective. And that this value can't be overstated, but particularly, and this was Ivor Hartman in the first African speculative fiction anthology, which is if you can't see and relay an understandable vision of the future, your future will be co-opted by someone else's vision, one that may not necessarily have your best interests at heart. I think that this is actually the power of visioning, right? It's not just about like, oh, it's nice to tell these stories of how we got things right. It's about how my story with my values and histories and perspectives might be different to yours, but if the only one we ever hear of is yours, mine is going to be sidelined, right? And I think we're seeing that with narratives across the world, that there are large parts of the world whose narratives have been and continue to be sidelined and marginalized. And this is one process of being able to foreground those, to recognize them, but particularly for their potential to contribute to understanding the kinds of radical transformations that we know we need to get back into that safe operating space. So again, we're talking about speculative fiction, but there is a groundedness in the science and reality and the data of what we need to do. So we've done some work with the Ngoni Kingdom in northern Malawi. So these were images from the Nature Futures Framework exercise we did with them by Maputo Soko, Jimmy Malinga, and James Tambula. And we came up with an anthology called Mambera Rising, which is free to download. You should go and check it out. It's really, really great. So the two writers, Muti Flema and Karen Gundula Chirombo, wrote these three stories that was edited by myself and my then master's student. And they also did a podcast series actually on the process of writing these, which is quite a lot of fun. So yeah, there's a short video clip as well on this. But this is one way of being able to engage in. And what we were hearing was that the book was making it onto book clubs in Lilongwe, right? That people were like, oh my gosh, we don't have stories about futures in our part of the world. This is like really, really exciting. So it was more about getting outside of publishing our academic papers, getting to a place where we can still use science in interesting and creative ways. We also did a process for the high seas. I put these 3 images up, and I've given you guys a triangle. This is how I make that. Can you tell me maybe which corners of the triangle each of those images representing? So the top one? Which is nature. Which is nature, yeah, there we go, exactly. And then the bottom right one? Nature versus nature's culture. You see, you don't need words, right? I mean, I could do this in multiple different languages again, but artwork talks, right? It's clear what we were trying to represent over here. That's the other, really important aspect. It was interesting to see in the CBD monitoring framework that they've included, I think, linguistic diversity as one of their indicators. And that's because, English, we default into English, not very useful for a lot of terms. But artwork doesn't need to have a translator, right? You can understand where someone's coming from or where it is they want to go based on a much more creative process. We also did some short stories for this. This was the Nemo Chronicles. Basically, they tracked down a really dodgy felon who'd been trying to collect the genetic material from a deep sea turtle, I think it was, species. Anyhow, they caught up with him. They were trying to work out one of the various ways that the Global Ocean Council was going to torture him for information, or not torture. In one of the stories, he was tortured. Another one, he was given a meal. And another one, he was visited by a cybernetic whale who was sort of the ocean coming back to to hold him to account. There's a whole story written up in the paper. The second one was the nature's culture, which was about, it was an interesting one because we were like, oh, we've solved the problem. We've got a global sort of ocean science council. Everyone's sort of meeting on things. We've got seasteading communities. It's fantastic. And then suddenly Adwara Shaki Papa rocks up and she's biohacked her body with CRISPR technology to be sort of half mech or shark. And so she can sense, guys, this was speculative fiction, okay? So she can sense the next one it gets even better. Actually feel the impacts that a lot of sort of these developments in the ocean have been having. Like, okay, it's all very good and well, you think you're being sustainable, but actually you're having sort of really impacts that you can't sense because you don't have the sensory capacities of this, but you're actually impacting some of the nature around you. So this whole idea of you think you've solved the problem, but with a different reframing or perspective, actually you might be opening up some others. And then the final one is the sentient sewers of the sea, where basically we've sent a whole lot of microbes down to fix sort of methane holes in the deep ocean. But they're sentient, they can communicate, and they're not particularly happy about being sent on this mission. And so this is the argument that they say, listen to me, I'm tired of being talked about instead of being talked to. And there's a whole revolution of the Gaia swarm is what we landed up calling there. So it was quite fun, again, just using stories to unpack some of these conversations in a way that's not necessarily threatening, but is getting us to think about the world in very different ways. This is brand new, hot off the press, hasn't yet been submitted, but we ran a coral reefs workshop in Moria in July this year. Came up with 3 more stories. This was really, really tough because positive stories of coral reefs, that's the hard one, right? Especially with a bunch of scientists, because you're like, what is it that we really can do around it? We're very, very clear to a tipping point for coral reefs, if not already reached the threshold. But the idea that, well, you can actually still do something, local management might work, you also need to be holding global drivers to account. But let's not write them off just yet, right? Maybe they're more resilient than we think. I just came back, so the reason I was in Korea was the second installation of nature futures in the demilitarized zone of Korea, which has been a really, a really amazing process of sort of seeing the space, which is, well, probably the most militarized, demilitarized area in the world. But it's because nature has thrived because people have not been able to enter it, right, for the past 15, 16 years. And so what are the kinds of species there? How could it be used to seed a particular ecological corridor across the Korean peninsula? So the idea, the tiger, I think, is actually, it's the national symbol in Korea, but it's locally extinct. And so what would it mean to, we're talking about dancing the tigers again, actually bringing tigers back. I think it was some stories around smoking with tigers and a lot of these myths and cultures that were sort of being reinvigorated and reimagined. And we did the pathway building this past week when I was there. So that's another one. And then finally, this is my last provocative slide, because this is all very good and well, but actually we see futures is a lot more complex. And so you try and navigate your way through this figure. But in essence, it's really trying to understand that all I've been able to do in this presentation is actually the blue line, which is thinking through particular past, through a present, and then understanding what we call a futures code, opening up of what those types of futures could be. But we also need to recognize that there are multiple pasts, many of them that have been erased, that have been plausible, that have been myths of what has happened in the past that still inform multiple presents, because we all have different histories, different parts of the world have different histories that inform different presents that we inhabit. And that we also have very different ways of thinking about the future, that it's not just this linear notion of time going forward, that we have many ways of sort of loopy time, right? This sort of the infinity loop you see on the side, or what I had in the middle, the representation of the Sankofa bird, which is from an Akan term, Ghanaian people, or people in Ghana, of this idea of you move forward, but sort of looking backwards with the seed of sort of knowledge in your mouth, right? That you need to be looking towards the ancestors, towards the past as you move forward. So an ongoing connection between what's gone on before that you take with you into the future. And we still haven't gotten there yet, right? Like I went all the way from sort of coming up and sort of giving you the latest science on sort of the problems we know we're sitting outside these boundaries, we need to go back into them, but we need to get back into them without actually doing it in an equitable way whilst we're still meeting needs. How do we do that? Okay, we can come up with these different stories, we can ask people, we can be imaginative, we can be creative. But actually, when we're really thinking about time, about foregrounding diverse knowledge systems, we need to be a lot maybe more sensitive in terms of how we actually take these things forward into policy, into decision making. So this is not solving the problem. This is creating a whole lot more problems and challenges that we're going to have to deal with. But something that I wanted to end with before going there. And yes, I'm ending with a quote from The Economist in 2011. Oh, sure, all right. That humans have changed the way the world works. Now we have to change the way we think about it too. So, thank you.
Over to questions. That's terrific. I'll kick off with one. You showed a convincing argument, but if you don't get these voices told, the stories told, other voices take over, dominant voices. Do you find evidence from your work in Malawi or elsewhere that people are changed by having crafted these narratives? What happens to them in terms of their behavior, in terms of how they act in the surrounding environments?
So I think, and I've actually got a postdoc at the moment who comes from psychology, who is actually trying to do a much better job of trying to understand what that cognitive change is going through a participatory process. I don't think we've necessarily seen direct different actions from going through this kind of process, but I do know the Nkosi Amukosi actually came and I got some of the books and was like really excited to have some of these stories. And they've been trying to look at, oh yeah, we do need to restore the Miyombo. Oh, we have actually realized that there's particular relationship that we have with the land. They were talking about some succession at some point from Malawi in the story. So you can also have these politically tense discussions that are emerging in narratives. I think one of the most important discussions that happened in one of the groups was this idea that everyone was saying, well, we can't imagine a preferable or aspirational future from now. We have to go back to a pre-colonial moment and actually start to sort of offshoot from there. So thinking back to that diagram, like you can't do it from the present, but if we go back, relearning what that looked like, we could then take that forward. So that was just in the process of discussing things, I think really interesting insights that you start with me and these like this.
Thank you. Now we can open up as well. Yeah, is there a microphone? How are we doing this, Stephen?
If you just speak loudly.
There's microphones around.
I'll try. Is there any specific methods you use in participatory workshop to sort of unleash imagination?
Sure, so there are quite a few that we've worked with. The main combination that we've done is starting with what we call the seeds approach. So things that are happening right now that people think are important but are quite marginal. And then kind of thinking, okay, if this were the dominant way, what would the impacts be and how would those connect? So there is a way to sort of get people thinking in, yeah. So the hardest thing is to get people to stop thinking about the present in the future, right? And so that's a really good way of kind of leapfrogging into sort of, no, this has already been done. I don't care how we did it, but it's not dominant. What are the impacts? And then you backcast from there. Using those characters, so the cybernetic whale and Nemo and the rest were like actual characters that we developed, that we put into the participatory process and said storyboard them. And I don't care if it's really terrifying for you that you have a cybernetic whale, but like deal with it in your story. Throwing wild cards. I did that in a workshop on geoengineering once, where I said, okay, then you have I think it was something crazy like 1.5 meters sea level rise by 2120. And they were like, this is impossible, it's never gonna happen. I'm like, I don't care, it's happened. Come up with a story for how it did. And became the Bruce Willis scenario emerged, where someone went and set off a bomb in the West Antarctic ice sheets. And it turns out that you can actually get that level of sea level rise if you destabilize the ice sheet. So those kinds of techniques sort of that force people to think in different sorts of ways. And quite often, in fact, we've always had a performance after it. Sort of when the groups are sharing, it's not like, here are my sticky notes. It's what does this future actually look like? A museum visit, or in the DMZ, we actually had someone who was being the tiger and rolling around and strumming with that. So like actually bringing arts into the process.
Thanks for a great talk. I really take your point that it's easy to think about the dystopian futures, and it's hard to think about the kind of positive futures. So I think that's really great, and enabling that kind of creative approaches to build a better world. But if we can then take that and develop concrete initiatives to try to move towards that positive future, the reality is that we will face this sort of polycrisis, the rolling crisis that is happening, and we're locked into a certain amount of disruption. Mm-hmm. So, how do you then try to build that back into the kind of scenarios to kind of make them future robust, I guess, and more feasible and achievable in the face of some of the disruption that will.
So, I mean, I think there's also important to point out that we use the future in many different ways. And so visioning preferable futures is one cut of that cake to sort of open up the space, to sort of try and get the imagination over dystopian ideas and start to build some of those narratives, those pathways. It's in the pathways that you have the knowledge you come up against the current system, against power. And I think it's still important to see how you navigate that. But there are other sort of robustness testing of some of these scenarios of visions where you're like, okay, that's great. Let's put it into a standard matrix for some of these drivers. And how robust is this narrative to the fact that you see a polarization or like a shift to the right or these kinds of dynamics, right? Or sort of a complete economic collapse or decline. Is it not, could you make it more robust based on some of this? Again, also understanding that these are not, then we're not going to get to that future, right? This is not about forecasting, right, or projecting futures. It's about building imaginative capacity, about the kind of orientation that you want to go towards, thinking what are the indicators that are important in that future, not that that's the future I'm going to get. But you also just, we tried to submit by 2:00 today. It's a proposal to actually bring some tipping points dynamics into it and actually think through this element of uncertainty and non-linearity that we know within the polycrisis interconnection. This idea of positive tipping points, right, we think can go in good directions. I'm a little bit more hesitant on that. But it can also be negative, right? And there can be cascading impacts. And like, can we use this idea of surprise and uncertainty and narrative to help us think through what some of those connections are? Because it's easier to tell in a story sometimes than it is to get the right numbers together in a model, that they can probably work much more closely together. So we actually have some of the PIC modelers from TIPNIF trying to work with us in the storylines. So not yet done, but yes, important, and maybe we'll get there.
Thanks, Laura. I was thinking about, I want to ask a question about the great triangle. So the nature for nature, nature for society, nature for culture. I was wondering if this, when we think about amazing temporal dimension that you bring us, the past, the present, and future, is the triangle gonna be like a pyramid? Or is like if we add a time frame on this triangle, is the triangle still the triangle, or gonna be chiseled around a bit?
So the triangle is supposed to operate across multiple scales and times. So that is one thing. There are a whole lot of interesting diagrams that we had, but the idea is that if the triangular space, they say the global level, was supposed to be a combination of multiple triangles, right? That you're not just wanting an extreme here, it is kind of closer to the middle, but knowing that that middle is never going to be what actually happens in place, that there are multiple different scales that you could do almost like at a pixel level to get to that. But there's also the idea that right now we're sitting outside the triangle, and over time, we would start to sort of move towards different, and it's really hard to do without visual. There's one, we've just got like wavy lines from the present sort of through triangles to the future. But yeah, the idea is that it's a heuristic that should be used across, and in theory, we should be able to use across multiple spatial and temporal scales.
So obviously convincing sort of the governments of the world and industries of the world to adopt this kind of imaginative vision is going to be difficult, but it's not necessarily impossible because, for example, nowadays we have Ecuador, for example, the constitution mandates as the goal of the state to promote the goodness of nature and all of that. So given that we know that it is possible in the modern day, even though it's very difficult, what do you think the pathway is to go from just convincing sort of people and communities to take this more imaginative approach to the future up to convincing governments and planning commissions and industries to take this kind of vision as well?
So I think there are multiple different intervention points, right? So I think the first one is the reason I put those Hollywood movies and extrapolations sort of stories up there, because I do think popular culture is a really important imaginative way that we can start to see some of these ideas. I think most people in this field have read Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. Can we get more diverse ones out there so that people are talking about these stories? So that's, I think, one important intervention. As you say, governments, like there are many governments that we're not going to get right now to do that, but there are examples, as you said, of rights of nature discourses. I think New Zealand's also, it was the sort of Pacific people that were rights of the whale, so that there are legal frameworks that are starting to take this into account, and I think those examples are powerful. They are codified within law, and that they can be strengthened. There's some discussions actually taking that into, for example, the GBF negotiations, right? I think we've also got a duty as researchers and scientists to be producing the paper or the evidence that we take and say, well, you can't ignore this because this is actually what we need to be doing. Whether you're gonna convince anyone who is benefiting from the status quo that this is the way that you need to do it, I'm not sure whether that's something that we necessarily can do, but I think these others are important ways to at least address, again, putting my research hat on this really big knowledge gap that we have at the beginning, and then to do our best to get it into more of the policy interface. I think we're also quite aware that policy is probably 5 years behind what's actually happening in the real world in terms of shifts. So that's also something to take into account.
Maybe building off that question, I really love that 6 dotted thing within the triangle, because it really reminds me, firstly, of the debate between the new and old conservation over the last couple of years, last decades or so. And also, I'm from the east of England. There's a big debate going on at the moment between like building green infrastructure on prime ecosystems and habitat. And again, I can sort of categorize the people I know and meet and the views that I have into these different things. So I wonder then, talking about politics, is this actually new for politicians, or is this revealing the politics that was already there?
I think that's probably the latter. I think the most important thing of that framework was, so most critical social scientists, and sometimes I do wear that hat, are like, well, yeah, we've known that diverse values, like obviously it's payload, it's messy, like dirt, right? It was the modelers that are like, oh yeah, right, instrumental, they're like, we don't know relational values, we don't have indicators around this. This is important, this is how we can reconfigure things. So it actually started much more from the science, like largely quantitative sciences, sort of realizing that it's messy, it's complicated, that there's a reason why the outputs from our models only show a particular way, even though we know in reality that it's sort of doing different things. But I think there's also important aspect for the science to show the politics that is happening. And I think that the other important thing, and this is where, again, we haven't solved the problem, but I was mentioning the fuzziness of the boundary of what we do deem to be preferable or aspirational, right? That's not a clear-cut line of like, you're in the triangle, you're off the triangle. There's some aspects where you're clearly far outside the triangle in terms of sort of massive deforestation, destruction, extractivism, etc. And there's some examples where this is obviously inside the triangle in terms of relational living within a particular sort of cultural respectful place, for example. But drawing some of those lines around the edges is I think the task that we need to do, right? Because at some point we do need to be, we're talking about the science policy interface, helping to inform or give the evidence of like, yes, this is good policy, this is bad policy, this is why, or this is the set at least of policies that we have. And make sure that you're not only preferencing this particular aspect, because these are also important, right? And I think, yeah, it's about making explicit, it's about making evident in a way that, yeah, we can, it's not perfect, but it's better than what we had before.
Marcia, thank you. I just had a question. I liked your graph that was where Costa Rica was sort of the closest to social justice and having good nature policy. But you said, okay, those were set on a country level, right? So there must be examples in the world where it's not on a country level, where you do have areas that are in that top quadrant we want to get to. And I guess my question is, you've obviously seen and traveled and experienced, and some of us have. So how do we get like the policy makers or even the academics to experience that when they're setting and they've got the interdisciplinary and the intercultural experience, that they can, in their fields, they can set those markers as to what that top quadrant, to meet that social justice and nature-centric approach. How do we get them to get, to understand that?
So I think two aspects to that. The first is, that participatory approach, the actually bringing people together in place to experience, I think is really important and to learn that way. So maybe some of the stories, the narratives again, can make that cognitive dissonance actually resonate a lot more in terms of what is possible. I think on the other side, it's actually, and I mean, we've been struggling with this in this process with the UN Development Report on, but what are those indicators? So I think the reason that you're not seeing anything in the top left is that how we measure those social sort of indicators is based on exactly sort of these extractivist processes, right? Like it's about GDP, it's about all of these processes of how we look at the economy. And I think that you're going to need to reconfigure some of those factors, and you might actually be seeing some countries shift or move. And again, examples from around the world, definitely there are people and cultures and places. Quite often they would probably still fall short in terms of our standard development metrics, right? And so I think that it really is about, yeah, the shift is, you know, a lot of these narratives are like, what does a well-being economy look like? Some of these post-growth configurations. And I think we need to do a lot of work in terms of measuring what that success actually looks like. Again, when we're looking at that safe and just, what is that, well, safe operating space, what is that baseline level that we need to be achieving? And what are those numbers?
It'd be nice to know that we don't have to imagine that there are places in the world
think
that
so.
exist.
Rachel.
Thanks. I wanted to ask more about the scenarios and what kind of how they were used and what kind of impact they had within there. Thinking about like IPCC and SSPs, one of the interesting things is that as climate scientists are like always hesitant about saying anything about the probability or like the preference for any scenarios, whereas like actually coming up with like desirable scenarios or like positive scenarios is quite a different process. And yeah, I guess I just wondered more about what happened in the event. Also, do you think that scientists should be less hesitant about actually like trying to back a scenario?
I mean, the thing is that actually, in all honesty, all of those climate ones, I'm just like finish writing the tape, are based on levels of uncertainty, but it's in the underlying narrative, right? It's not in the numbers, that's not taken into account. So if you run SSP 5 to 8.6, RC 8.6, right? You can give me a probability bound of like what the impact of alpha is, but there's no way that you can tell me what the likelihood of SSP 5 actually occurring in the world, right? Because it's not going to occur in the world. So actually, at what point are you like? There's a whole black box. I've got a whole other of the narrative scenarios and the numbers that we use to designate those before we even go in there, and yet we still come out with these great, beautiful like graphs of uncertainty barriers, right? But there's so much uncertainty before you even get there. And I think you need to acknowledge that. And as soon as you acknowledge that, then you can start to do a lot of this other messier qualitative narrative storyline building, which is I think where biodiversity scientists have always kind of known that, because it's a lot messier working in context with place and people and values and systems and ecosystem services, etc. And so I think, you know, IPCC, IPBES have started to work together on this. We work with a lot of integrated assessment models on this. The Earth Commission is trying to work out how safe and just transformative corridors might be mapped using the same models, the IAMs that we use for climate. So I think we'll get there. But I think we need to be much more honest in terms of where is this uncertainty actually lying. And if you can't tell me what food price is going to look like in 2 weeks' time, necessarily with the shock event, tell me that you can run it in 2050 based on this climate projection is, you know, important, but definitely not a fact-based forecast necessary.
I have one question, maybe a bit related to Rachel's question. So how much do you work more on positive scenarios, like the ones that are expanding imagination or possibility, than other scenarios that are like possibly more negative or like more associated to risk? How do you manage both sets of scenarios? Do you contrast them? And then my other question was like, how then you use them for modeling, or how you help modelers translate these into levers, or like expanding their questions for researchers?
So in all honesty, at the global level for models, the SSPs are good enough at doing a lot of dystopian work for us. We haven't really done too much of that. I think you could definitely think, but I think these uncertainties, these risks, these concatenating, interconnected polycrisis events is where we probably do need quite a lot of work. Still, we've seen this big gap in these aspirational and these preferable features. That's sort of largely what we've been focusing on. Also understanding that, like when you close your eyes, that my preferable future may not necessarily be what yours is, right? And that whole value clash, right, is actually at the core of the politics that we're talking about, right? I want a protected area that people never get to enter and that the elephants get to exist. I'm like, I've always lived with the elephants over here. Please stop, please stop stopping me from accessing my ancestral land, right? So that in and of itself has enough craziness and cash to work with. Well, we have started to, so we don't have a big data set like we have with the SSPs in terms of like all of these data for countries. Are trying to work towards that, but at the European level, they have run some land use change scenarios, and I don't know exactly which assumptions they changed in. I think it was. No, it wasn't Alex. It wasn't Magpie. I don't actually know which model Peter's group used, but they have done that at the OEL paper in 2023. And then Peter Alexander did that at the global level. So they have started actually to model some of them, and I don't know the specificities of that, but it has been, they are working on it. Trying to translate it, but we don't have global storylines in the way that we have 5 SSPs, because we can't agree on what those 6 endpoints could be. They're illustrative narratives at this point. So to do it officially under FNs has also been quite difficult. So now, as of this month, the community of practice, we are sort of trying to establish, get everyone to work on this in their own way.
Yeah, it might be the last question. It's really great. So polar opposites. Yeah, so well, welcome back to your alma mater, and thank you for a really good talk. Yeah, I'm here with my mom, and she's not an academic, and so we come along to these talks sometimes together. And one of the things she mentioned, and I think it's really true, and I struggle with it myself, and it's something I work with in the Leverhulme Center and in my own work, is what you do with the art. So you put up the art and you sort of said, I do this in my class, and I say, which one is the nature for nature, which is the society for nature, and then you said, yes, that's correct, or yes, that's correct, and people, but art is really subjective, and what I'm finding I work mostly with like rural and indigenous people in the global south, in the Amazon. Sometimes when I work with artists in my work, they actually have to tell me what it is they're interpreting from my work rather than the other way around. And I'm wondering how because I several of us are really like in the department are really interested in fostering much more artistic, expression of science. But I don't fully agree with your, assertion that, you just show it and the person understands. Because actually, in my experience, quite a lot of the art that I've shown of my science that people have made, people haven't understood. And I've had to explain, based on what the artist says to me, that's your burning forest, or that's your peatlands, or that's your whatever. And I'm wondering what you think about that. I mean, to incorporating that into teaching, for example, aside from other kind of events that we do, how can we do that in a more sort of in a way that's that allows for like one's own perspective in terms of that interpretation? Can we do that without the artist present? How much do we have to engage with the artists, and what was your experience of that?
So I think in the same way as we use the future in different ways, art can also be used in different ways. So the whole point of that was that the artist was with us and was like, I'm here and I'm trying to capture this corner of the triangle. And it was very clear, right? So yes, the whole point of that was communicating in a specific way that you could see there were no people in the nature for nature scenario. So it was pretty obvious, right? Nature's culture, nature's society, not so much, but that was the artist who designed it specifically with us in that process. There's a very different way of using art where it is about the artist wanting to convey a particular message, meaning, interpretation, right? Which no, I'm never going to be able to say. There is no right or wrong answer in that essence, right? And it's not about using art to communicate, only art is a practice in and of itself that needs to be respected. And I'm not an artist and I'm not an expert in that, so I'm not even going to pretend, right, to do it. I'm going to leave it to the artists or to the humanity. Same thing with storytelling, right? Like it's not just like tell a random story and now suddenly, you know, you can take a whole bunch of humanity from it, right? There's been work that's also been done with music, right? So I think that in this instance, it was designed specifically for that particular way of conveying the triangle. But I mean, if you look at some of the other art, that, for example, Simon, well, yeah, that's about the triangle. They were in different points in the triangle, but you're never going to be able to tell which one is which, right? Because you're not supposed to, because it was actually really messy and complicated. Each of the different groups had a different discussion that was coming out. So that was not the point of that art, but it's about, you can see in the images the kinds of discussions or the emotions or sort of what was being aspired towards in that without actually sort of designating specific aspects of it, right? And similar with, that was AI. Yeah, those are also different. So they were inspired by the triangle, right? But the ultimate stories that emerge, I mean, that's just conveying things in very, very different ways, right? But I don't know, I look at, especially her, I'm pretty intrigued, right? I want to read that story. I'm like, there's something underlying that's tagging to me, not in a cognitive scientific graph way, but in a what is happening, right? And I think that's also the beauty of art. It gets to those emotional, creative aspects of us, right? Not just using it to communicate, but the instance that I showed, it was specifically designed to do that. We worked with the artist who was in the process with it. But actually, how we got to it was, I think I showed this one. That was Clay Creative, Kim Humwood, who actually did the art for the high seas. And this was a whole process of, there was, yeah, with the transformative change where we like created this thing and it emerged around us, and then we painted Guillermo with like black oil that was the presence of the, yeah, it was all sorts of really interesting, like active creative processes that if I showed you the photos, the pictures, everyone would be like, I have zero idea what's going on. Why are you showing me this? But it was a really important process for the people in the workshop to go through to then land up with those three images that we saw. So again, understanding that there's a process that gets there that is equally important.
I think we will wrap up now. That's fantastic. Thank you for a fantastic, inspirational. Thanks, Frank. What would you say on the